There's been many changes over the years in the waterborne coatings field. In the last 20, 30 years, the continual need to improve performance to get to a more environmentally friendly type of a system for rail applications has changed the types of resins that are used and the way that they're formulated. Really starting back in the 1950s was when the first latex polymers were introduced that were used in architectural type coatings, house paints. And so industrial coatings was just a natural progression for rail car owners.
Flammability was a very big issue. It's still a big issue. They could not paint in the shop that was not explosion-proof electronically. They would be non-flammable. They didn't have to spend millions of dollars to make their buildings explosion-proof to accommodate the solvent-based coatings.
I just want to say one word to you.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, sir, yeah.
Plastics.
They really started in the mid to late 1960s where they were primer top coat systems. The performance was okay, but not up to the standards of today. In the 1980s is really when the terpolymer latex products were first introduced, and that was to expand upon where waterborne coatings were at the time.
In the 80s, the perception of water-based coatings were that they were harder to work with. Drying times, the ease of use of the coatings, those were things that were presented as barriers that you could not get past.
Some of the misconceptions with waterborne coatings, people say, oh, water over metal, hey, you get rust, right? That's never going to work. Issues were things like melting points and also the adhesion. When you have particularly dirty, greasy substrates, maybe contaminated with oil, water will not wet out over that kind of surface. And so properly prepared surface is the best to start with for a waterborne coating.
They had to be applied in multiple coats to build the thickness because each coat needed time to exhaust the water.
The quality of the resins were always there because of the same resins that were used in the solvent-based coatings. However, their carrier was water and not solvent, so they had different application properties. And those application properties caused problems in the shops, and that's what we had to work out over the years.
At first, the painters are a little standoffish because it was something that they've never sprayed before. The painters' opinions changed after several applications and usage. They saw the benefits comparable to or versus the solvent-based paints.
The solvent-based epoxy, it's cross-linked with a polyamide, which does not have any UV resistance, so it will chalk within the first 6 months to a year. The water-based epoxy doesn't chalk because it's cross-linked with automotive acrylic, but it also has the corrosion resistance of the epoxy.
And so why do you need that? You need that for things like increased solvent resistance. And so, when they get used over tank cars for rail applications, you want a little better chemical and solvent resistance in case there's any spillage onto the paint surface.
As time went on and we started seeing the history of the car out in the field, that the gloss retention was far superior to any of the solvent-based paints. It really doesn't change for years.
Our company was not particularly concerned with the appearance of the paint, but as we began to do our lab investigations, we began to realize that the water-based acrylic durability was tied to improved longevity, which could mean cost savings for the company. I don't know if they were using the terms green and stuff like that at the time, but everybody knew that emissions are not that great.
Many of the manufacturing plants, they're regulated by a limit of how much VOC can go up their stack, sometimes by day, by week, by year.
So the water-based coatings lend themselves well to that type of environment. Customers want to be associated with that kind of situation.
In the early 90s, I was given the assignment to convert our painting operations to Waterbase. There was no commercially available product at the time that seemed to meet our needs. So we embarked on a co-development project with the supplier, and upon our lab testing, we proved that 2K Waterbase were viable, good performing materials for painting tank cars. And the durability that we could not get with the other paints that we were looking at.
We introduced water-based coatings in the rail market at the facility I worked at in late '93, early '94. I found that the sprayers adapted very quickly.
There were some tanks painted with that 2-pack acrylic epoxy system, and comparing it on the same tanks and tanks next to each other with solvent-borne epoxies. The acrylic epoxy system had much better durability, and that really translated to better corrosion resistance because that epoxy system was breaking down. It eventually corroded before the acrylic epoxy system started to fail.
There wasn't the solvent smell that you had with other paints. We reduced our hazardous waste consumption almost $150,000 a year. EPA loved us.
Over the course of a 7 or 8 year period, all our painting activity was 2K water-based acrylic, which culminated in 40,000 plus cars being painted. Basically, our experience was that the 2K water-based acrylic epoxy was a very functional drop-in replacement for alkyd paint for the exteriors of rail cars.
With the DTM water-based coatings, we've seen cars in service that the customers can view that have been there for 20 plus years in what's deemed to be a critical service, like an auto rack.
So there's a gigantic savings there.
As time went on, gloss retention and VOC emissions became less important, and cost became a more important driving factor in our company's paint selection.
The chalking and that aesthetic piece is not always that important to a car owner when the car's out there riding on the rails.
Okay, right now we are in a paint shop in Ostróda in Poland. GATX Ostróda has been using water-based coatings for their production. Here you can see they are coating freight wagon.
While a few companies in the US, like GATX and Union Tank Car, decided to use water-based coatings on a limited basis, concentrating on the use of high solids 2K solvent products, many companies such as Trinity and Greenbrier in the US and Mexico, and National Steel in Canada, plus several European customers presented in this film, embraced water-based coatings. Over the years, they expanded their use and realized the added benefits of improved durability coupled with low emissions.
Europe has concern with environmental emissions, and that was the driver to come to legal requirements in the 90s to restrict the emission of solvents to the air.
One of our biggest clients' main criteria was for the gloss retention of the wagons, and they were apprehensive, but after they'd seen the results of using this water-based paint, all of those apprehensions disappeared.
Especially in the chemical industry, they need to be resistant against some chemicals. A drop of chemicals can touch the surface, and even that the paint must withstand.
We are producing wagons the
whole period of year. The wagons are running in whole Europe, maybe in the south of Europe where it's not so cold, but it's running also in north of Germany and different temperature. We are talking about minus 20 plus 50.
I nie jest to ani drogie, ani kłopotliwe, nie zajmuje dużo czasu. Także to jest bardzo ważne z punktu widzenia kosztu samego procesu odnawiania powłoki malarskiej.
The biggest benefit we found is that it shows really reduced shocking effect, where you have a gray cloud on the paint after 2 years or 3 years.
My wwozimy w naszych wagonach materiały dosyć agresywne, a szczególnie agresywne po zetknięciu z wodą. Dla nas najważniejszą cechą tych farb jest ich trwałość.
We still have 5,000 or 6,000 water-based acrylic epoxy cars running in our fleet. The appearance has held up and the durability has held up for 18 to 20 years.
The oldest water-based paints on our wagons would be approximately 30, 40 years old.
We put it almost 100% of all our freight cars because freight cars, they don't come in back into shop for repairs or anything for a longer period of time.
Wagon, który pomalowaliśmy w 2004 roku, do dzisiaj nie był malowany, chociaż już był w zakładzie naprawczym i był naprawiany. Natomiast nie była naprawiana powłoka malarska.
The benefit in the repair, you don't have to repair.
Since we use this paint, we didn't have any claims in operation. And the oldest wagons painted on the water-based coated is more than 10 years. It's state of the art to paint water-based paints, and it's not longer a question. We paint water-based, that's it.
Looking back to the history of water-based coatings and from the data presented in this film, the durability is indeed what it was in the solvent systems, and in many cases better.
I've got a thing about trains.
Another turning point, a fork stuck in the road. Time grabs you by the wrist, directs you where to go. So make the best of this test and don't ask why. It's not a question but a lesson learned in time. It's something unpredictable, but in the end is right. I hope you had the time of your life. So take the photographs and still frames in your mind, hanging on a shelf in good health and good time. Tattoos and memories and dead skin on trial. For what it's worth, it was worth